It's Tuesday, and you know what time it is for us. It's Close of Business Tuesday here at TPH. We've got something quite fantastic for you. I know, I always say it, but it's completely true. With everything that's been happening in the Mideast, and with all the concern we have in the energy community about everything from OPEC to Iran, we couldn't think of a better friend to have come visit with us than Ambassador Ed Djerejian, the director at the Baker Institute at Rice University. I'll get into his background a little bit more as we start the discussion with him, but he served 8 presidents while he was in the Foreign Service. He was the ambassador to Israel. He's so familiar with the region, and he's a great friend to TPH, so we're super lucky. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to our discussion series.
Thank you very much, Maynard. Great to be with you.
Well, before we get to the ambassador and the discussion about the Mideast, guys, let's do a quick run through, and we've got a surprise guest, Deanna Zhang, to talk about our disruption conference next week. But before we talk to Deanna, Mike, what happened on the screen today?
Yeah, Maynard, it was a little bit of green, a little bit of red, and I think what's going on right now is the market is really focused on what OPEC is going to do. I think as we came into the weekend, I think most people felt it was going to be a pretty easy meeting. They were going to bang out, roll over the current cuts, maybe look at 2 to 3 month extension. Crude price was kind of hang around here, and then we'd have to have demand get better, and voila, we're back up to $50 on Brent. Well, as usual, things are not as easy as it first seemed, and it looks like we don't have any consensus right now. It looks like the meeting that was supposed to end today is being pushed to Thursday, and so crude oil is trading off a little bit. And I'd say, honestly, given how much rhetoric there's been out there, crude oil only being off $1 since the weekend is pretty phenomenal right now. So what that tells you right now is the market thinks that there is going to be a rollover. There might be a little bit of a craziness between now and Thursday, but I'd say the market's dialing 85, 90% chance the deal is going to get done as originally anticipated. Now, if we don't get a deal done, that's going to be the big surprise, and people are going to start thinking about how things played out in the March OPEC meeting when prices were down $10 to $12 in a day. I don't think you're going to see that happen right now. I think there's going to be something that's going to come out, but that is a risk. And I'd say it's more of a risk right now the market is currently dialing in. And I'd say the risk is probably more like 30, 35%. Something doesn't get done rather than 10 or 15%. So, that's where we are at this point in time. I think sentiment, equities have come off more than crude oil right now because of, they ran up more than crude oil. So if we do get a deal, I think there's going to be in the back of people's mind that, okay, what happens at the next OPEC meeting? Let's just get through it right now. So the way I look at it is if we don't have anything occur here, we probably got 10 to 15% down in crude oil prices, and you probably got as much down in energy equities. If we do have a deal like most expect, you're probably going to see crude oil up a little bit, but I think the equities outperform like they have been outperforming over the last 4 to 5 weeks, because then it's going to become a demand issue rather than a supply issue.
All right. Well, we'll get into more of the scenarios, I think, as we talk to the ambassador. Matt, what's going on? I know you wanted to talk about the macro gas call that the research department has been focused on.
Yeah, Maynard, the research team's been extremely busy to start the week. We put out a macro update for natural gas, looking at our forecast for 2021, 2022, and 2023. As we've discussed previously on 2021, generally we felt like the strip was fairly reflecting fundamentals. Unfortunately, we've seen a little bit more supply show up in the system. So we were originally forecasting in December exit rate volumes of about 89 BCF a day. Looks like a little bit more production has showed up here. So we're now seeing volumes around 90 to 91 BCF a day. And that, in conjunction with a slow start to the winter, has taken down our strip forecast price for 2021 to about 270 to 275. So things are fairly, when looking at 2021, I think things are in fairly good shape. Really where we've become more constructive has generally been on the 2022 and 2023 curve. And this really has to do with increasing LNG demand and a relatively flat market from a supply perspective. But I think the key takeaway from client conversations is we need to see the industry hold the line on production, particularly out of gas basins. If producers move back to a situation where they grow around 5% per year, our forecasts are going to become much more bearish than they currently are. We think out of the Northeast and the Haynesville, which represents about 45 BCF a day of supply, producers can only grow about 1 to 2% because there is a lot of associated gas in the market today. So as we think about what that means for price, if we see a limited supply response from gassy E&Ps and they do cap growth at 1 to 2%, we do forecast gas prices in 22 and 23 potentially reaching $3.30 an MCF. If we start to see growth head up from there, I think you're going to see a negative response from an equity perspective because clients are going to become worried that the fundamentals are going to deteriorate. So our message to clients in the industry as a whole is growth is really not a warranted outcome for the industry. We think maintenance capital is really the path forward. Pay down debt, reduce your base declines, and start to accelerate shareholder returns. And that's really going to be the winning strategy for equities. And I think that's something we'll be looking for to hear from corporates as we move forward over the next 12 months.
Matt, just on that, don't you think if gas prices are in that 275 level and you know, that's a profitable place for most gas producers to produce, isn't it going to be tempting to grow faster than that, to de-lever and to just generally make more cash flow? Are you concerned about that?
It definitely is a concern, and we're seeing the Haynesville privates in particular allocate capital towards growth. So if you look at 2021, we do expect about half a BCF a day of supply coming out of the Haynesville. That's essentially being offset by legacy gas basin declines in areas like the Pinedale, Piceance, et cetera. So 275 is kind of a healthy point for the private industry. The public producers have been a lot more constrained on their growth plans. Most have laid out plans where they need to see the forward curve at $3 per MCF over a multi-year period. They'd like to then hedge that and potentially add back some production to the market. But again, this is really in the hands of the producers. If they respond with too much supply, and we can't think about round numbers, we need to be thinking about 1 to 2% growth. If you start to see production levels tick up towards that 5% range, things are going to get pretty bad pretty quickly, especially as we step out into 2024 and 2025, because the global LNG market actually moves into oversupply, and we don't really have those demand tailwinds we're seeing in 2022 and 2023. So big picture, it's really up to the industry. Do they want to drive volume, or do they want to drive value to shareholders? And at the end of the day, you know, we think the rewarding strategy here would just be sticking with maintenance capital, but we'll have to wait and see how things play out.
Okay. Well, let me, Colin, I know we talked about the order, but I want to grab Deanna real quick because I know you've got some Mideast slides that'll set up our conversation with the ambassador. Deanna, tell us what's happening next week. I know we've got the 4th annual TPH Disruption Conference. You're the mastermind that's helped orchestrate this whole thing with our team. Tell us what is happening.
Yeah, so Disruption is next week, the week of the 7th. It's actually our annual energy technology conference, and this will be our fourth time doing it. This year's theme is rebellion, as per kind of the unusual events that have been happening throughout this year. And format-wise, we're actually rebelling a little. It won't be a typical Zoom conference. It's going to be completely virtual, but we're going to be using Hopin. And we're actually going to be incorporating a virtual reality component. So for our company presentations, we'll be doing 360-degree videos. And so you'll be able to experience the tours as if you're experiencing them in firsthand, in person. So yeah, we have a lot of interesting companies represented across, you know, robotics, hydrogen emissions monitoring, flaring mitigation, just all sorts of technologies across the energy tech sphere. John Arnold, Alice Jackson, and Bob Armstrong are our keynotes. And we also have a really solid set of panelists for each different region. So it is next week. It's Monday will be Houston, Wednesday will be Denver, and Friday will be Boston. We're going to try to make it as interactive as possible with kind of the virtual reality component, and then with a bunch of different networking features on our platform. So hopefully it won't be just another Zoom conference. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm really excited for it.
Well, it's our fourth annual. It is always really fun. You see lots of great people and great technologies and interesting companies, and it just invigorates you. Maybe next year can be invigoration. But Deanna, we're going to forward this. I'm going to find your parents' email address and forward this edition to them, because we got some great news today. Forbes magazine named Deanna one of the 30 under 30 stars in energy. And TPH we're crazy lucky to have you, and we're so proud of you. So I know I'm embarrassing you, but keep up the great work. We're really excited about the conference, and we'll attach a link to it, all the information for everybody here. But okay, Colin, we got to warm up. We got the ambassador. He's on deck, and we just thought we'd do a little macro Mideast pregame. So take it away.
Yeah, well, last week, recall Ken Hurst reminded us of the importance of knowing the numbers if you're going to navigate risk successfully. So ahead of this conversation, we thought it would be helpful to anchor everybody's understanding of where the numbers are by going through a couple of tables. And as Mike said, there's been a bit of a delay in the OPEC meeting, and if you read press reports, it's often portrayed as UAE and Saudi Arabia having a little tussle over their respective quotas. But if you look at this table, I think some interesting points come out. What we've done here is we've listed the OPEC 10 countries on the left, then the OPEC countries that are not part of the OPEC Plus deal, the non-OPEC countries that are part of the deal, output in December 20, what was pledged for December 20, what is pledged for all of 2021, and where we are relative to the baseline cuts. And a couple of points come out. One is, as of right now, by our best estimates, OPEC Plus production relative to baseline is down 5.75 million barrels per day. Now that's a pretty big supply cut, but it's supposed to be 7.7. Now, when we get into 2021 and all the way to April 2022, it's supposed to be 5.7. So you can see here that we've had a bit of a jumping of the gun. Now, if I told that to you in the absence of any other context, you might assume that it's one of the OPEC members who has done this. And certainly Nigeria falls in this camp up here. It's producing 115,000 barrels per day above pledge. And Iraq is also there at 66,000 barrels per day above pledge, although that's down quite a bit from where it was before, as you can see in these spark lines. This first panel is 5 years, more or less, of monthly production from June 2014, that famous price peak, through the end of last year. Then we have the COVID period here in the middle panel, so it's a different interval of time, 12 months instead of 67 months, and then we have the forward period. But the key to take away is that actually Saudi Arabia and UAE are living within their pledge. The problem is these non-OPEC countries. And a couple of months ago, Mike was reminding us of Kazakhstan and Nigeria and some of the numbers at that point in time. But look where we are now in December. Russia is producing more than 1 million barrels per day above quota. Oman, 207, Kazakhstan, 341, Azerbaijan, 97. So all told, that is 1.95 million barrels per day above the promise, and 92% of it's coming from non-OPEC. So just a crucial little thing to keep in mind over the next couple of days as you think about the OPEC Plus meetings, and then also what we're about to talk about with Iran. And then two other points, and that is that if we look at these 4 countries that are excluded from the April 12th pledge, we're seeing a pretty meaningful uplift in December 20 relative to the April 20 levels. In fact, it's been about 816,000 barrels per day. Most of that, of course, is coming from Libya rocketing back from its near zero production earlier this year. But a key question mark for the incoming Biden administration is going to be how much Iranian production is allowed to come back, whether the sanctions put on by the Trump administration stay intact, or if this 1.95 million barrel per day number is allowed to get up to 2.3. We'll see. That's a debatable point. For now, what it means is that total OPEC 10 spare capacity is at 5.9. Total OPEC spare capacity is just below 8 million barrels per day. The non-OPEC group here, not all of non-OPEC, but just this group, is at 1.7. And notice here down at the bottom in a memo item, the United States is now producing 11 million barrels per day of crude and least condensate, which means there's about 2 million barrels per day of spare capacity in the US. And this is just the crude and condensate numbers, excluding NGLs. So we've got about 11.6 million barrel per day spare capacity globally. That obviously is a pretty heady number and suggests that we could see in oil the same dynamic that Matt just described for us in gas, that if price got far enough, fast enough, that we could see the deterioration in the steel and a movement back to where we were before. Quickly, I just want to make two other points, and that is what's interesting about the appointment of John Kerry as the special envoy for climate. At least one thing that we think is interesting is, of course, he was involved with the negotiation of the JCPOA back during the Obama administration. And so what's immediately going to happen with the new administration is some tension between the objectives on limiting hydrocarbon production and perhaps allowing it to come back from Iran. And so all you're looking at here on the left-hand side is CO2 emissions from primary energy. You can see the United States in 2019 was 15% of the world. Canada was 2%, Mexico was 1%, Europe was 12%. So about 30% from these countries. That is equivalent to about where China is, 29%. You can see Iran at 2%, Russia at 4%, India at 7%. So really a key question of what's going to happen with this wedge with Iran, and a reminder that we often think about CO2 emissions as only coming from the energy industry. Actually, let's not forget that energy is 73% of total global greenhouse emissions, and we still have industry, waste, agriculture, and so on. And so my final point would be, as all of this is happening and all these geopolitics play out over the next couple of years, let's keep in mind that the renewables sliver for the world in terms of energy consumption mixed by fuel is at about 5%. Europe leads the world in that mix at about 10%. But when we look at Iran and Russia, really still this very heavy focus on oil and gas. And to give you one other number, when we look at all energy, primary energy consumption from all of these different sources, the footprint is about 280 million barrels per day oil equivalent. So you can do the math with each of those mixes to figure out what it means. Just a heavy reliance in the near term on the hydrocarbon footprint. And so something that will clearly be part of those negotiations.
Okay, fantastic. Colin, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Mr. Ambassador, I was just, looking over your resume. We've known each other for a long time. Your accomplishments are stunning. And you served presidents from Kennedy to Clinton, and you served the country after that. You've helped many presidents and many administrations, and you're the person that many people call for advice. I won't ask who's been calling you. I'm guessing your phone is ringing. But maybe one place we could start is you saw many changes in administration in the course of your foreign service career. And you saw how that affected policy. And of course, you were watching the Mideast for much of your career. All of us in energy land are, of course, wondering how changing from Trump to Biden affects policy, affects attitudes in the region. What is it like to be in the State Department when there's a change in administration? And how are you thinking about the changes that might happen as a result of Biden taking over in the Mideast?
Thank you, Maynard. Well, this is an exceptional period because of all the transitions that I've been involved in. The rules of the game were basically followed in terms of a political transition symbolized by the new president raising his hand and the former president sitting down, showing it's one of the most symbolic acts of the American democratic tradition. That's been really put into question now with the Trump administration, whose policies have been both on the domestic and the foreign policy front, and I'll just concentrate on the foreign policy, have been transactional and much less traditional. We're talking about disruption. I think Trump has been very heavily influenced by people like Steve Bannon, who believes in the disruptive mechanisms to shake things up, reform them, and move forward on a transactional basis. That's changed what we're seeing here today. The fact that the Biden administration has just only recently begun access to the daily presidential brief, the CIA briefings, shows the tension that's been created in what we've seen in past presidential transitions. So I think on the policy front, we know what Trump has done, both domestically and in foreign policy. On foreign policy, he has really drawn away from the liberal global order that has been sort of a keystone for the last few decades of U.S. foreign policy, and has gone America first, which means that he's not a multilateralist. He doesn't believe ipso facto in international organizations like the UN, like NATO, like he has his problems with the EU, etc. So what I think the basic change we're going to see is going from the Lone Ranger America First approach to a much more multilateral classical approach of the conduct of foreign policy. That, I think, is going to be a key characteristic of Biden, and the team that he's brought in all are of this mode. We're seeing a lot of people that we know who have been in the Clinton and the Obama administrations coming into the foreign policy field. And that may be good, or it may not be that good. My one reservation, I'll be very honest with you, is that I hope that some of the people in the Biden team coming in have learned some of the lessons of unbridled multilateralism to become more geopolitically realistic in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. I think they have. I think some of them have learned these lessons. I've been listening very carefully and touching base with some coming into the administration that they realize that the political scene, the geopolitical scene has shifted since they've last been in power and are ready to adapt. But we'll see how that goes. I think one of the key areas to watch is China. The U.S.-Chinese relationship is absolutely critical, as we all know, for all the reasons we know. But Biden he's a good politician. He's reading the tea leaves. He knows what the public opinion polls are saying, that Americans have become much more skeptical about China and what it represents on the human rights agenda, what it represents on its aggressive attitudes, for example, in the South China Sea, the Uyghur issue, and many other, the espionage into IT and computer chips, the overabundance of the United States on Chinese-based supply chains, be it pharmaceuticals or other key items, minerals, etc. So Biden is not going to do a reversal of Trump's very frontal policies, confrontational policies with China, but it's going to be more of, let's see what we can do to gather some of our friends and allies to face China together. That's going to probably mean a softer approach, but not definitely an approach that hasn't learned a lesson that we have to stand up to China's more egregious actions. In the Middle East, let me say this, Maynard, in all my experience in the Middle East for many years, I've never seen the region in the last 5-6 years, ever since 2011 and 12 with the Arab uprisings, the so-called Arab Spring. I've never seen the whole region in such disruption at various degrees when you go country by country. And what happened in 2011 and 2012 in the Arab uprisings, I refer back to that. You may think it's not relevant. I think it's very relevant to what we're seeing today, because those popular uprisings had no leaders. They were basically youth-driven, and they called for not only reforms, but for the removal of the existing political order and structures in these various countries. It started in Tunisia, and then like a match lit on dry straw, just went throughout the region. And we saw what happened in, of course, Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, Libya, and beyond. it's also if I could use this term today, it remains a political shock to the leaders in the region. And also, and especially in many ways, the Gulf leaders who maintained regime stability, but the fear of popular unrest drove them to address the necessity of moving forward, not just on words, but realistically on economic and social reforms, not political reforms, because they're maintaining their autocratic systems because it's political survival. And we see that in the UAE, we see that in Saudi Arabia with MBS in 2030. But they're looking over their shoulders because they know that the critical issues that started out in Tunisia, where the youth said enough of unemployment, enough of non-access to education, enough of the corrupt systemic regimes that we have to live under, et cetera, et cetera. They realize that they face many of these same issues. And so there's a fragility in these regimes that ostensibly seem very strong and are in many ways because they're monarchies and they control popular opinion, but they are very worried. This underlies MBS's whole program of 2030 and reforms. And what you're talking about here, too, to Pickering, I mean, is so essential to that because he cannot conduct these reforms unless he has the resources that come from the energy sector of Saudi Arabia. And so what you're talking about now in this OPEC conference is critical. These are critical manifestations that impact on the regimes and the countries throughout the Middle East, And I think you'll remember that the conventional wisdom is that Saudi Arabia needed $80 a barrel oil in order to balance its budget and institute all the programs that it wishes to initiate. I think that's been lowered to something like in the $50 range. I'm not too sure exact figure. But the fact is that they are highly dependent on that revenue coming in order to proceed with their programs. But even the point I'm making geopolitically is regime stability.
So that's great. That is, I don't think it's something we talk about enough. How would, so you just tied how oil price fits into revenue, fits into keeping the place stable so you can stay in power. How does the relationship with Israel fit into that calculus, if at all? Because I think that's the other thing we're all trying to understand is what is this warming that's going on with Israel? Is that related to allying against Iran? Or what's the way to think about what's happening with Israel?
There are two things there. I think you pointed to the major reason, which is the Iranian Sunni Arab confrontation, if you will, the Shia-Sunni split. It's not a religious split, it's a political split for influence in the region. It has very little to do with religion, but it has everything to do with political power and regional influence. Iran considering itself to be the mainstay, and perhaps in their own eyes, Persia as the major factor in the Middle East, and of course, countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt saying, no, we are the real leaders of the Muslim world. And of course, Saudi Arabia has that special position of the king being the custodian of the two holy places. So there's a lot, this is all about power, political power with a religious overtone. But I think what we're seeing in terms of these normalization agreements, they're not peace agreements. Frankly, they have very little to do with Israeli-Palestinian peace. They are very Trumpian transactional business deals that the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan have bought into for two reasons. One, especially the UAE, I think, is very concerned, as is Saudi Arabia, about Iran. And they're very worried about Trump's principled position, in his eyes, of removing the US military presence from these never-ending wars, which is a good goal. I mean, Afghanistan, we're going into 20 years in Afghanistan. There are very important negotiations now underway in Doha for an agreement. And they're essential. The outcome of those agreements is going to be essential for whether or not we withdraw in exchange for firm commitments that Afghanistan and the Taliban will share power in Afghanistan, but will never allow Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups to use Afghan territory, so that we have a repeat of 9/11 in our country. And it's important to realize how important that is to any American president sitting in the White House. Not one president wants to be responsible for saying, you withdraw our troops from Afghanistan. They gave safe haven to terrorist groups, and look, this embassy has been bombed, or this has happened against us, or anything. So the stakes are high in those negotiations. But the Iranian-Arab competition, if you will, or confrontation, is one of the major drivers. Trump's real desire, even before he leaves office, to even further withdraw American forces from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, bother the Gulf countries a great deal, because in the past, we were seen as the security umbrella. Ever since the Obama administration, they have begun to question that. I'll never forget, I have to be a little discreet about this, but a few years ago when I was in the Gulf, I was meeting with one of the most prominent leaders there in the Gulf countries. And he looked me in the eye, and this is during the Obama administration. He said, "Ambassador, where's the coach?" In other words, the question arose whether these countries can depend on the American security umbrella. And that's only been exacerbated under Trump. And so they're looking at how they can enhance their own security capabilities. And Israel looms large in that. And that's one of the reasons that they are, talking with Israel, normalizing.
So in your career, you saw the Shah and his regime, and then you saw the Iranian hostage crisis, and then you saw the Iran-Iraq war, and then you saw the U.S. Desert Storm and all that. So you saw quite a few things. What's striking to me is I think Iran was always basically, I don't know how to say it, maybe an enemy of the U.S., at least in the hostage crisis on. And so when you think about the nuclear deal with Iran, does everybody on both sides of that debate agree that Iran is a concerning actor and they're just debating what's the right tactics to deal with him? Or is there actual genuine debate about Iran's intentions, and some people think they're not as concerning as others? How would you characterize that debate? Because we're all watching that single element of Biden's policy and wondering how that plays out.
Well, I think the only approach to that, either if you're liberal or you're conservative in foreign policy, is to just take a line out of Ronald Reagan: trust but verify. I would say in situation with Iran, verify and verify. So it's not a question of really trying to determine their intent, because that goes nowhere. That could be, you might as well get a marriage counselor to conduct your foreign policy in that. But you have to look at Iran's interests, our interests, our friends' interests in the region, and then go to the negotiating table, listen to them very carefully, see where they're coming from, determine whether there's any common ground between us on this critical issue of the nuclear capabilities. And if there is, if you determine in a very objective manner there is some common ground, go for it and see if you could come to an agreement. Now, this is what I think Joe Biden is going to try to do. He stated that, but I believe he and his team realize that the Iran they're dealing with when they come into office is not the Iran they dealt with under the Obama administration. Maynard, I was a supporter of the JCPOA. And the reason I supported it is because, yes, it was an imperfect deal. But if you looked at the intelligence, and I did the analysis from whatever sources I could, the JCPOA, first of all, we had strong allies with us on that. France, Germany, Russia. We were able in that agreement to put a timeline, and that's been criticized, a timeline, the sunset clauses, to restrict Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities by intrusive IAEA inspections, by closing down certain centrifuges, by a series of measures that gave the world a timeline of not a few months where Iran, if it wanted, outside of an agreement, could go nuclear weapons, but gave us about 10 or 15 years the way you calibrate it. To me, that was a time frame where whatever administration was in power in Washington could negotiate more. The very underscored deficiencies of the JCPOA is that it did not deal with ballistic missiles, which I think was an error, and it did not deal with Iran's malignant behavior in the region. Well, the deal was not addressed to deal with Iran's malignant behavior in the region, but to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons power, which would then start Saudi Arabia, even countries like other Arab countries wanting to go nuclear, which would be a disaster. So I think they're going to go back to the table, but I hope they have their eyes wide open, because the Trump sanctions, these massive sanctions that Pompeo has been going after in such a high profile, it has only reinforced the political position of the hardliners in Iran and the IRGC. It has diminished the political influence of Rouhani and Zarif and the so-called, let's not talk about moderates and hardliners, but the more flexible power contingencies, components in Iran. So the Iranians are going to go to the table with their own demands that are going to be quite strict. They're not going to just say, no, we'll do whatever you want, just let's go back to the agreement. They're going to have their demands. So it's going to be a tough negotiation. And I think they're going to go for, the first thing I think they want is the secondary sanctions to be lifted so that countries like Europe and others can do business with Iran. And they can sell their oil, which is critical for them.
So do you think we're going to see this year, so much has happened this year, you forgot about it, but we had the U.S. took out the general early in the year, the Iranian general who purportedly was behind quite a lot of anti-U.S., basically killing U.S. soldiers. And then we saw the scientists recently, what took place there. Do you think the Iranians, are we going to see a counter? Should we be worried about some sort of counterstrike or terrorist activity that comes as a result of either one or both of those strikes?
I'm very concerned about that, Maynard. I think we're at a very dangerous period, potentially, between now and January 20th. There are certain agendas at play in the Middle East. And there's no question that the Prime Minister of Israel wants to do everything possible to stem Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities. He's made that very, very clear. He would like to get American support for that. He would like to get Arab Gulf support for that. But it's a very fragile and dangerous line. The Iranians, as I'm sure you and your people have noticed, have been very circumspect on this. There hasn't been a knee-jerk reaction. There may be a violent reaction that we see in the coming days from them, depending on who prevails in the inner councils of Tehran. But the Iranians, I think, are going to, what they would prefer is playing the long game, wait for Biden to get in, and then see where that relationship goes. But we are in a fragile and dangerous period now, which I hope neither side will enter into lethal action because of these assassinations and incidents.
What do you think about the influence on, it'll be interesting, we've got John Kerry, so you have a returning Secretary of State, someone who was heavily involved in the Iran deal, now as the climate czar. Any feel for what that starts to do to foreign policy? Because as you go through, of course, China, we saw in Colin's chart how much of the emissions in the world come from China. There's all sorts of implications around oil, of course, but what do you make of that? You have a returning Secretary of State sitting in a new spot. I guess he's on the National Security Council. I think I read that, but how do you sort that one out?
Well, I think Biden is fulfilling a campaign pledge that obviously beyond COVID, that one of his highest priorities is going to be climate change. Really differentiating himself from President Trump and his administration. So I think he's fulfilling a campaign pledge and putting a very high profile personality in that job. How effective that job will be translated into action is anybody's guess. I've always been skeptical about, because I've seen so much of this, special envoys, special emissaries, and you create a new bureaucracy and it looks good, but very little happens. But if John Kerry can succeed and he's given the power to really bring the whole American government together to craft a coordinated climate change policy that includes all the factors, the key factors necessary, be they geological, be they economic, be they energy, environment, all of this. If you can bring that all together and they can come up with a coherent policy that can get international support, bravo. But let's see, more so than not, in my experience, these special roles are more ink on paper, if you will, and not very effective.
Mr. Ambassador.
But I wish him success. I wish him success.
We do too.
I wish him great success.
Picking up on Maynard's question about the killing of General Soleimani in January, even before that, in September of 2019, there was the attack on Abqaiq, which it's generally acknowledged was probably a drone attack launched from Iran. That really hasn't sort of sustained with a lot of attention, but obviously it was a pretty important deal. And it almost seems like this is, one incident where the diplomats are like, don't talk about it so much because it is so bad. As you connect those dots on, what you talk about and what you don't, one thing that we see in markets responding to this is a great nervousness about the oil price after each of these events. They didn't get bullish after Abqaiq or Soleimani or even the assassination of the scientists this past week. In fact, they got very, very nervous about cascading effects that could send oil prices down. How do you think about that sequence of events with your great experience over so many presidential administrations?
I'm glad you pointed that incident out, Colin, because I think that was one of the game changers in the Middle East that reinforced the attitudes of many of our partners in the Arab world, and looking at how they can enhance their own national security needs without perhaps that taken for granted American umbrella. When Trump said the attack was not on an American target, that sent shivers throughout every Gulf leader in the region. And he was upfront. I mean, whatever you think of Donald Trump, he says what he thinks. And he said, hey, this wasn't an attack on us. It was an attack on another country. But that, I think, had a catalytic effect on, because if you remember, what happened after that was both sides, the Iranians and the Arabs, looked over the precipice, didn't like what they saw, and drew back. And then you had these reports of Oman sending someone to Tehran, even the UAE contacting Tehran, Qatar, of course, with its relationships with Iran, and of course they share this huge gas field, and so they have a congenital relationship with Iran. When you look at all that, it's Saudi Arabia, even Saudi Arabia. So that was a major event that had a chilling effect on everyone. So I think one of the good things that came out of it, and I think what you're saying about its impact on oil prices, is that let's not go over the precipice. Let's step back. Let's see what can be done short of war. Because the Gulf countries have to feel very vulnerable to an outbreak of war in the Persian Gulf region. Because it doesn't take too much to destroy a lot of the energy infrastructure on both sides. So they have to be very cautious. But let me say one thing. I think this is interesting for all of you to consider. A lot of people say, oh, America's withdrawing from the Middle East. America's withdrawing from the Middle East. Politically, we've taken these steps that we're discussing, right? That from Obama to Trump. But by my calculations, the American military presence in the broader Middle East, including Djibouti, South Asia, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, we have something like 60,000 military personnel stationed in the Middle East. If you look only at Udeid Air Force Base in Qatar, our forward base and central command, our central command for air power. If you look at the Fifth Fleet that all of you know, since 1949, based in Manama, that has been guaranteeing the free flow of energy to world markets through the Strait of Hormuz. Fifth Fleet is still there in Manama. If you look at the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, I mean, and all the other personnel and bases we have, including in Turkey, the American military presence in the greater Middle East is huge. My concern as a former diplomat is, why aren't we using this power much more deftly in our diplomacy? Because that power that we as taxpayers are paying for should be played very skillfully, much more skillfully than we played it in Democratic and Republican administrations, in my eyes. Much more skillfully. And if you look at a guy like Putin, a great country, Russia, historically and everything, huge landmass, but Russia's economy is about the size of Spain and Italy's. But look how skillfully he plays a weak hand in the Middle East. So I think, I hope that the Obama administration is learning these, has learned these lessons, will learn these lessons, and will come into power, and we can have a much more effective and coherent policy toward the Middle East. What I did not mention, Maynard, is that my great hope would be that we go back to the days when, for example, the policy planning department unit in the State Department, led by giants like George Kennan in the past, that there are some people in our foreign policy and national security establishment that will sit back, not get involved in the daily crises, because I've been there. Every day there's a crisis in the world. And you get bogged down in putting out one fire after another. But that we have the capability, and we certainly have the capability in the minds, to step back and strategize. How do we connect all these dots in the Middle East? Energy, religion, politics, culture, socioeconomic problems. How do we put them together and craft a effective American policy toward the region? I don't have any illusions about that, but frankly, at the end of the day, that's what we need.
Mr. Ambassador, one question along those lines. I think we've been really struck by, as we've been hosting some great guests, and as we've talked about the energy transition, we've been struck by how much of the fundamentals of the energy transition will be strategically positive for China. Right? They've been very good at reaching out and controlling, various mineral supply areas. They're going to make a lot of the solar panels and other components. They're pushing hard with batteries and battery technology. They're a country that for a long time has been worried about its oil and gas supply. So the energy transition affects people in different ways strategically. The U.S. obviously just achieved an approximation of energy independence. But how do you think about the energy transition? If you were in the White House now and we were talking about that as a strategic issue, Europe is totally for it. They also don't have a lot of their own oil and gas, but some, but not plenty. But you know where I'm going with this question. Everybody just tends to be in favor of what helps them. And
Right.
How would you be helping the new administration sort through some of those issues?
I think one of the greatest lessons we should have learned from COVID is the absolute necessity for the United States to review strategically its strategic supply chains in order for us to be able to gain security and resilience and sustainability. And that, obviously, energy, where we're in a favored position now, computer chips, pharmaceuticals, the whole gamut. And therefore, you're asking about China. I think that policy, if I were advising the White House, I would say this has to be one of the major infrastructure priorities of the United States going forward. Our public health security, pharmaceuticals, energy, computer chips, our minerals, rare minerals, supply chains, resilience. Not that we can do it all in a protectionist, only America way, but to have the reserves necessary that when the next crisis comes in any of these fields, that we're not left bereft and at the mercy of a country like China or India in terms of pharmaceuticals, for example. This should be a priority. I don't think it's going to be looked at strategically that way. I hope it is. And I recommend on China, our Center for Energy Studies, Gabe Collins, who they put out a very interesting report on how to address the China issue on these matters. And I really recommend you read it because I think it's an excellent report, and we're doing what we can to make sure that the incoming administration reads these types of reports that we're putting out for the transition.
I'm glad to hear that. Gabe is a great analyst and a great friend. So
Right.
I would wholeheartedly recommend people read that report. One thing that in the past has gotten in the way of grand visions of geosecurity has been unexpected problems in unexpected countries. And so one could, think of the cliche of Vietnam and all the stuff with Kennan and et cetera. We haven't talked about Syria. And Syria seems to flash up and then come back down again. And yet it's right there at the intersection of Turkey and Russia and Europe. How should we be thinking about risk in Syria today?
Good question, Cole. You'd make a great foreign service officer. But the pay isn't as good, Colin, so I've got it.
Thank you.
No, look, let me put it this way. I'll give you an anecdote. What happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. This was brutally learned when the civil war occurred in Syria. We did a report at the Baker Institute. We brought it up to the Obama administration. We were urging the administration to do more. And the decisions that were made at that time. But I think what Washington did not understand fully was that what happens in a country like Syria in the Middle East, when you have a collapse and a void, like we're seeing now in Lebanon, by the way, which is a separate but connected issue. that it has an impact on United States national security interests and can even affect, in the case of Syria, our transatlantic relations. Why? How? I recently stepped down after being on 8 years on the Carnegie Corporation of New York Board of Trustees. One of the other trustees was a man by the name of Lionel Barber, who was the editor of the Financial Times. Great guy. I said, Lionel, this may sound like a bizarre question, but what happened in Syria have any impact on Brexit? In a way, I thought it was a naive question on my part. He looked at me and said, Ed, absolutely. He said the perception of all these thousands of Arab refugees coming into Europe bolstered the Brexiteers, not only in England, but also in other countries, and had an impact on our own transatlantic relations. So the question you asked is very important, because these voids that are created don't just stay in the region. Syria now is a cut-up state. Bashar al-Assad controls most of the territory. He's regained it by being absolutely very resilient in power. But he called on the Russians and Iranians to keep him in power, and they've done so. And they've done that very effectively. But what is victory? If you're sitting in his presidential chair in Damascus, and I've been in that office many times, and you look at your country, 6 million people displaced internally displaced, 6 million, 5 million refugees, 1.1 at least million in Lebanon, almost 900,000 in Jordan, 3 million about in Turkey, and those who could escape to Europe and elsewhere. What are you reigning over? Yes, you succeeded to stay in power. And if that's the end game, well, what kind of legacy is that? And you are highly dependent on now 3 powers, Russia, Iran, and Turkey in the north, who has its own agenda to support its territorial integrity against the Kurds. So the situation in Syria is dismal. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. And I think what the new administration should do is take a fresh look at our policy there, get real about it. I do hope as part of that, and it's just not based on Syria, but to really, humanitarian relief is important, but I would not advocate that the US taxpayer pay for the reconstruction of Syria when Iran and Russia and Turkey are major players in that country. That doesn't serve our interests. But I am a proponent of humanitarian relief, as long as it gets to the people. But then we should be supporting the Geneva Initiative for a political transition, because there's no military solution and only a political one, and that's going to take time. But that, I think, is what needs to be done in Syria. And in a broader concept, when you look at these conflicts like that, I do hope that the new administration will open up a strategic dialogue with Russia, with Putin. Look at what we did. I mean, I was there, served in Moscow in the height of the Cold War in the embassy. I was the political counselor there during the Brezhnev era. That was the Cold War. That was mutual assured destruction. That was our prime enemy. Yet we were constantly talking with the Russians. We were even negotiating nuclear disarmament deals with the Russians. This is not a love match. You deal with your adversaries. You don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your adversaries. So I hope that we get smart, geopolitically smart, and we start opening up a dialogue with the Russians, with the Chinese, but a real, straight, not let's get together to be together and hold hands, but a real strategic dialogue with 2 of these major players in the world. I
wanted to ask you, though, you and the work that everyone's doing at the Baker Institute is so helpful to the country, to the energy community. I want to thank Ken Medlock in particular. He's a great source of information and great
He's
thinking
done a great
for
job.
us. Fantastic. Could you tell the rest of our viewers a little bit about some of the other things you have going at the Institute, just so people have a feel for it?
Sure. Well, very briefly, I've tasked all of our directors of our centers and our programs to do presidential transition papers in their respective fields. And it's amazing, we created the Baker Institute, and I've been there since the beginning, is that we chose our research agenda on the principle of comparative advantage. I didn't want to be one of these think tanks that tried to emulate the Kennedy School or the Hudson Institute or the Hoover Institute. What do we have here at Rice University in Houston that we can build on? So obviously energy was one of the first things, energy capital world. Health policy because of the Texas Medical Center. We got great economists, we do tax policy and fiscal policy. And, because of Secretary Baker and myself, we do foreign policy, and especially the Middle East, and it goes on and on. But the issues that we're dealing with, including drug policy, space policy, the role of private enterprise in economic growth and small and medium enterprises, our Middle East center, our Center for Health and Biosciences, Science and Technology. All of these were chosen on the principle of comparative advantage. So if you look at some of the major issues that our country is facing, we're dealing with them. And we've been dealing with them for years. And so each one of these programs will be, and these will be all public. You could pick them up on our website once we produce them. These presidential transition papers will be made public. And so we're going forward now. We've just revised the strategies of all our programs for the next 3 to 5 years going forward. And we do data-driven and objective research, and then coupled with pragmatic and realistic and relevant recommendations, policy recommendations, to decision makers in the private and the public sector, and then general to educate the public. We do a lot with the students also in internships, and we have a Master of Global Affairs program, which is with the School of Social Sciences, and Ken Medlock is the director of the MECON program, which is the program of energy economics at the graduate level. So we're involved in the educational mission, we're involved in the research. But what we do is once we get something that we're particularly keen on, a research product or recommendation, we take it to Washington, or we take it to you guys in the corporate sector. We don't lobby, but we just say, here are some ideas. And so we try to be pragmatic and realistic and make a real effort. So this relatively small think tank, in the last 25 years, we celebrated our gala. Thank God there wasn't COVID then, but in October of 2019, and we had President Barack Obama as our guest, and it was a fantastic program. But I wanted to make the point that ever since we opened our doors in 1993, we have hosted every living former president of the United States at the Baker Institute. And that just symbolizes that we have become a forum that is respected and that's recognized nationally and internationally. So what do you do when you have a forum like that? Well, you try to get the best researchers you can. And what makes the Baker Institute is not so much the leaders of the world that we brought to our forum, but the research and the policy recommendations. So, Maynard, we're continuing in that tradition, and we have some very exciting new areas we're getting into. We're looking now. We're beginning to look and explore the role of artificial intelligence in public policy, and the digital world, and how that impacts on energy, how it impacts on health, how it impacts on a whole scope of areas. So that's a new area that we're exploring.
Well, it's an absolute jewel, and you've been there from day one, and it's an incredible place with incredible people. So anytime we can be helpful to you, we want to do it, and we encourage everyone who's out there listening. If you're in Houston, go over. If you're visiting Houston, you got to see it. It's just a great place that you've built.
Thank you, Maynard. And we're very proud of our relationship with Tudor Pickering.
Well, I think that's all we can do is say thank you, a huge thank you. We love our visits with you. You've been at our conferences, and we always learn so much. So thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Please say hello to Francois for me.
Oh, I will.
And,
you're one of her biggest. I don't know but she thinks you're just great. I don't know. I'm not jealous, Maynard, but she thinks you're just great.
Well, I'm a lucky man. Anyway, thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, and thanks to everybody out there.
Take good care, all.